They said no one could hold a collapsing wormhole. No one, not even the most advanced species in the Orion arm. But they'd never met a human. When the Orion Gate began to fall, entire civilizations ran for their lives. But one soldier stopped running. He stepped into the storm alone, knowing he'd never return. The refugees who made it through didn't understand why a man would die for people he'd never met. But humanity has always fought for more than survival. For us, it's about meaning. And as the last fragments of the gate disintegrated into the void, a question echoed through the stars. What kind of species chooses to die? For strangers? The stars over Orion burned with a steady light, cold, ancient, indifferent. And yet tonight, that light trembled. The wormhole known as Orion Gate had hung in the black like a silent god for 1,000 years. It was older than most of the species who now fled toward it. A colossal ring of unknown alloy, 20 kilometers across, suspended at the edge of a collapsing star system. Its surface glimmered with 1,000 blue veins of light, pulsing like the heartbeat of the void. But something had changed. The pulse was no longer steady. It was erratic, ragged, a dying heart. From the outer rim of the system, alien ships converged in a flood of desperate light. Freighters, warships, refugee barges, agricultural haulers, an entire spiral of civilizations choking the void with their fear. The comm channels were a chaos of screams in languages the translation nodes could barely keep up with. "They're coming, Velkath ships on the outer ring. We've lost the eastern convoy. The gate's field is destabilizing. It won't hold." In the command deck of the human carrier Vigilant Dawn, Captain Elias Rain watched the sensor display with the steady calm of a man who had seen too many endings. Green dots vanished one by one like candles snuffed out. The enemy was drawing closer, not in scattered formations but in a perfect cold arc. Velkath warcraft moved like an algorithm made flesh, silent, coordinated, merciless. The humans were not supposed to be here anymore. They'd been offered passage through the gate hours ago like the other races, but they'd refused, because someone had to stay behind. The gate needed defenders until the last refugee ship was through, and none of the other fleets had volunteered. They had technology, ships, entire civilizations to protect, but no one had chosen to stand. No one except a single human expeditionary detachment and a handful of allied auxiliaries too slow to flee. Far below, beneath the starfire, the wormhole itself began to tear. The first fracture came as a ripple, a soundless tremor that resonated through the hull of every ship in the system. Space itself quivered. On the observation deck, soldiers and refugees alike turned to look at the Orion Gate. Its inner throat, once smooth and calm like water, now writhed like something alive. The event horizon buckled, shuddered, flared. A golden-white fissure lanced across the ring's surface, spitting arcs of plasma into the void. Gravitational cohesion's failing. Someone whispered over comms, "The gate's dying." No one said the other truth. If the gate died before the evacuation was complete, millions would die with it. Entire species would be trapped on the burning edges of this system, where the Velkath would come like a tide. Elias turned from the display and stepped onto the deck. The young ensign at the navigation station stiffened as if gravity itself had increased. He wasn't tall or broad, just a man carved in lines of worn discipline. His face held the quiet weight of someone who'd stopped expecting to live long ago. "Status?" he asked. The ensign's voice cracked. 53% of refugees through, sir. Another 12 convoys inbound. Gate field instability at 38%. It's getting worse. Elias nodded once. He didn't waste breath on panic. And the enemy? Outer sensor net confirms contact. 35 Velkath destroyers, no. 40 now. The crew's silence thickened like frost. 40 enemy ships against 12 human vessels. Even calling it a fleet felt like a joke. But no one spoke of retreat. No one had to. There was nowhere to retreat to. Outside the human carrier, the evacuation unfolded like a storm of light and desperation. Sleek Creel bioships, all organic bone and fluid membrane, darted through the shimmering throat of the gate. The Darun flotillas came next, their crystal hulls burning with reflected starlight. Then the heavy haulers, hulking refugee barges carrying families, archives, seeds of worlds that would never be seen again. Every alien species had its own way of running. Some moved in organized convoys. Others fled in broken clusters, shrieking over comms. A few transmitted prayers into the black. Only the humans held formation, their destroyers locking into a crescent wall between the gate and the advancing enemy. They weren't the largest fleet. They weren't the most advanced. But they were the last ones standing between a fleeing galaxy and annihilation. Inside the ship, the artificial gravity trembled again. Bulkheads groaned like an animal in pain. Another fracture tore through the gate's outer ring, this time visible even to the naked eye. A spiral of light twisted out from it like the flare of a wounded sun. Elias walked to the forward viewport. From here, the gate looked like a dying star haloed in blue fire. For the briefest moment, it was almost beautiful. Then the beauty collapsed into dread. "Captain," came the voice of Commander Leora Hahn from Tactical, steady but tight. "The Creel fleets have cleared the zone. We've got 3 more convoys inbound from the outer ring. Estimated time to arrival, 17 minutes. And the Velkath?" 15. A cold smile touched Elias's lips. "Then we hold for 17. Leora stared at him, eyes hollow but blazing with something fierce. "Aye, sir." The Velkath ships emerged from the darkness like a geometry that shouldn't exist. Their hulls were black, starless, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Each vessel moved in perfect sync with the others, a swarm of cold intelligence. No broadcasts. No emotion, just a silent hunger to erase. Their opening salvo tore through the void like surgical lightning. 3 alien haulers ending too slow, too close to the outer rim, disintegrated before their distress signals could finish transmitting. Elias didn't blink. Engage. The human fleet surged forward, not away from the gate, but toward the enemy. 12 against 40. It wasn't strategy. It was math written in blood. The first clash was blinding. Human destroyers screamed into the dark, their railguns tearing star lances through the Velkath formation. Where alien species hesitated, humans aimed for throats. Explosions flared, plasma shells bloomed into violent halos. The void itself seemed to shudder from the force. The Velkath responded with precision, not rage. Their counterfire was clean, cutting through human armor like a scalpel through flesh. 1 human frigate vanished in a spray of molten shards. A second lost its spine but kept firing. The tactical board on Vigilant Dawn lit up with red, not as a warning, but as a promise. "Gate stability?" Elias barked. 29% came the answer. "It's accelerating, sir. Collapse projected in 40 minutes. Elias closed his eyes briefly. 40 minutes. That was all they had to hold. 40 minutes for 12 convoys. 40 minutes to keep a galaxy alive. 40 minutes before the void swallowed everything. Down on the civilian decks, refugees watched the human ships through reinforced windows, streaks of silver and gold carving fire into the night. Many of them had never seen a human before. Fewer still had ever understood them. Why stay? They wondered. Why not run? The Creel had calculated their chances of survival and fled. The Darun had abandoned entire colonies to save their archives. But the humans, a young species, barely 3 centuries into the stars, had chosen to face the storm alone. They did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because someone had to. And somewhere deep in the fabric of the collapsing gate, something seemed to respond. The wormhole's unstable light twisted toward the human fleet, almost as if the gate itself was watching them. On the command deck, the lights flickered. The gravitational shear from the gate rippled through space like the breath of a dying god. Instruments wailed. The sound was not mechanical. It was alive. "Captain," whispered Leora. "The gate. It's starting to resonate with the Velkath field. It's like it knows." Elias didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the gate. For a moment, a brief, impossible moment, he felt something. A pressure behind his eyes. A sensation of being seen, not by a machine, not by an enemy, by the gate itself. Then the sensation vanished like mist, leaving only the cold and the scream of metal. The Velkath pushed harder. Human ships bled. The clock ticked down. Above it all, the Orion Gate shuddered again. Another fracture split its surface, a luminous wound that cut across the night. If it collapsed too soon, everyone still inbound would die. Elias' rein straightened. His pulse was steady. He thought of the faces he'd never see again. Earth's oceans, a sister's smile, a promise made in quiet rain. "Tell the convoys," he said softly. "We'll hold the line." And outside in the endless dark, the 12 human ships shifted formation as one, like teeth bared against a storm. The fracture deepened. The gate groaned. The stars held their breath. The fracturing of Orion Gate had begun. The night of Orion burned brighter now. Where once the wormhole pulsed like a heartbeat, it now convulsed like a dying star. Golden fissures spiderwebbed across its great ring, every crack bleeding plasma into the void. The light it cast no longer felt steady. It was the feverish glow of something ancient slipping into its final moments. Across the system, alien ships scattered like insects before a storm. Convoys pushed at sublight toward the gate, their engines shrieking, every vessel trailing desperate energy signatures. Fear was not a concept in some of their languages, but they were learning fast. And behind them the humans stood, 12 warships. The last line. Captain Elias Rain gripped the edge of the command table aboard the Vigilant Dawn as red vectors bloomed on the tactical hollow. Felcath destroyers were fanning out, enveloping the human crescent formation like an iron wave. Each enemy ship moved with mathematical precision, not the chaos of living things, but the perfect choreography of something that had no doubt, no fear, no heart. "They're splitting into triads," reported Leora Han. Her voice was hoarse, but it didn't waver. "Vectoring to flank and envelop. Classic machine envelopment pattern." Elias didn't look away from the display. "They think we'll fold." She glanced at him. "Will we?" His lips twitched, not a smile, but something close. "Not yet." The comm crackled with overlapping reports, armor breaches, thermal spikes, hull temperatures redlining. Each human ship was fighting 3, sometimes 4 enemy vessels. Statistically, they should already have been vaporized. But humanity had a habit of disobeying statistics. The Velcath opened their second wave with surgical violence. Black, starless vessels drifted forward like blades, firing in perfect sync. Plasma lances slashed through the void, scarring human hulls, carving through shielding like paper. One destroyer, the Razor Wind, took a direct hit to its reactor spine. Its scream through the fleet net was brief but unforgettable. A ball of blue-white fire erupted where it had been. For the refugees still inbound, the explosion was a beacon and a warning. For the humans, it was a countdown. 11 ships, Leora murmured. Elias said nothing. He couldn't afford to. The Orion Gate shook again. This time the fracture was visible from every viewport in the system. A massive fissure split across the upper arc of the wormhole ring, glowing like molten gold against the black. Chunks of metal, if the ring could even be called metal, sheared off and drifted like burning leaves. Gravitational shear waves rippled outward, slamming into nearby vessels. Several alien freighters were torn apart mid-flight, their hulls snapping like brittle bone. Thousands of lives were lost without a sound. The Velcath did not slow. The refugees screamed. The humans held the line. On the lower decks of the Vigilant Dawn, the situation had turned intimate. Hull plates shuddered with each impact. Damage alarms bled into each other in a continuous howl. Marines ran through smoke-filled corridors to seal bulkheads. Emergency grav plates flickered, throwing soldiers against walls. A small cluster of alien children huddled in one of the evacuation bays, watching the stars through a cracked viewport. They saw human ships, fragile metal skeletons compared to their own massive haulers, standing shoulder to shoulder in a shrinking wall of fire. One of the children asked their caretaker what the humans were waiting for. The caretaker didn't have an answer. No one did. "Captain," Leora called out sharply, pulling Elias's focus back to the hollow. "Outer defense net just folded. Felcath units breaching left flank. Redirect the remnant and swordfall to intercept," Elias ordered. "That'll thin the right. They'll adapt no matter what we do. Better to bleed evenly than get cut in half." Her jaw tightened, but she executed the order. On the hollow, 2 destroyers peeled away, engines burning blue as they dove into the flanking assault. A moment later, the void exploded in a storm of light. The Velcath weren't fighting like conquerors. They weren't trying to claim territory or enslave refugees. They were trying to erase the gate itself. Every volley was precise, directed at the ring, the stabilizers, the throat. They wanted to close it, to trap everyone still on this side. The humans understood this. That was why they'd stayed. Aboard the Swordfall, Commander Janek Voss stared at the encroaching enemy. Half his ship's main guns were offline. His shields were down to 12%. But when the order came, he didn't hesitate. The swordfall dove like a spear into the formation of 3 Velkath cruisers. "Ram them," he whispered. His helmsman hesitated for half a heartbeat, then understood. They didn't need words. The swordfall's thrusters roared. The collision was catastrophic. A white-hot flare consumed a third of the left flank. The shockwave rolled through space like thunder through a cathedral. 2 Velkath ships disintegrated instantly. The third spun out, broken. The swordfall was gone. But the line held. On the vigilant dawn, the hollow flickered and another green dot winked out. 10 ships, Leora whispered. Elias's knuckles whitened against the console. "Keep the line." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In the chaos of war, quiet commands carried farther than screams. The last convoys were still crawling toward the wormhole throat. The Velkath were pushing harder, carving at the human line like surgeons dissecting a patient. Plasma fire raked across the flanks of the vigilant dawn, tearing holes through its armor. Alarms wailed. Deck lights dimmed, but the humans didn't retreat. They shifted formation again, not backward, but forward, closing the gap between the enemy and the gate. This was their way. When death came, they met it halfway. Above the battlefield, the wormhole's light twisted violently, folding into itself. Stabilizers flared. Time dilation rippled through the surrounding vacuum. Ships flickered like candles behind a storm. Every second the humans held bought another convoy a chance to make it through. But the math was cruel. There would come a moment, soon, when holding wouldn't be enough. In the chaos, one of the alien fleet commanders, a Darun crystalline envoy, broke protocol and opened a channel to the human flagship. Its voice was like ringing glass. "Human vessel, why do you stay? The enemy cannot be stopped." "There is no logic in this." Elias listened, eyes fixed on the spreading fractures across the gate. "Because someone has to." The Darun envoy said nothing after that. It didn't understand. But it felt something. For the first time in its long, crystalline life, it felt shame. Minutes bled like years. 9 ships, then 8. The Velkath pressed closer. Wreckage littered the void. Drifting skeletons of metal, tumbling corpses, and the burning trails of ships that once held hope. And still, the human line didn't break. Elias stood over the command table, watching the countdown on the gate's core timer. Stability, 22% collapse in 28 minutes. "Gate will not last," Leora said. "It'll last long enough," he replied. She didn't ask how he knew. It wasn't knowledge. It was faith. Not the kind aliens understood. Not numbers, not calculations. Just a man refusing to believe the universe could be that cruel. Another shockwave slammed into the vigilant dawn, throwing crew to the floor. Sparks cascaded from blown-out consoles. Bulkheads screamed. Somewhere deep in the hull, something ruptured with a wet, metallic groan. A lieutenant shouted, "Main shielding down to 30%. Reactor temperature redlining." "Keep firing," Elias said. The helmsman, barely 20 years old with a streak of blood across his forehead, looked back at him and nodded. No fear, just understanding. If this was the end, they'd go down facing it. Outside, the gate shone like a wounded god. The last convoy, 10 lumbering freighters heavy with the remnants of entire worlds, was minutes from the throat. The Velkath had begun ignoring the human fleet altogether, concentrating their fire on the gate. Elias understood then. There would be no retreat. No reinforcement. No miracle, only time. And how much of it they could buy. "Captain," Leora whispered, standing beside him now. "If we fall back, some of us might make it through. If we stay..." Her words hung between them like drifting ash. Elias turned to her slowly. He didn't look like a hero, just tired, but there was steel in his eyes. The kind forged in quiet places where no one watches. "We stay." The fleet net lit with acknowledgments. No hesitation, no speeches. Just men and women who had already made their peace with death. When the Velkath closed in for the final push, the human fleet answered with a wall of fire so fierce it lit up the fractured night. Railguns roared. Plasma lances carved arcs through the void. Explosions painted the black in furious gold. For a brief, impossible moment, the humans pushed them back. 8 ships, 7, 6. Each one fell not silently, but with teeth bared, in the refugee convoys. Alien eyes watched through fractured viewports as the last human ships vanished into light. They didn't understand why a species would bleed for strangers. But as the convoys crossed the wormhole threshold, one truth echoed through the frightened fleets. The humans didn't run. They never ran, and the gate, though screaming, cracking, dying, remained open a little longer. Elias Rain stood on the bridge of the vigilant dawn, lit by burning displays and collapsing stars. The line had held, but he knew what came next. "Prep the core access route," he murmured. Leora stared at him. "You're going down there." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the Orion Gate burned brighter than ever. The last line had held, but the cost had only just begun. The universe has a sound when it dies. Not a scream, not silence, but a deep, trembling hum, like a wounded heart still trying to beat. That was the sound pulsing through Orion Gate. The wormhole, once a radiant bridge of swirling blue fire, had fractured into jagged veins of light. Its gravity flared and buckled, folding reality around it. Metal screamed as the gate's colossal rings tore at their own structure, glowing with the heat of cosmic collapse. Captain Elias Thorne stood before that chaos, armor blackened and cracked, the air around him alive with static and the scent of burning ozone. He was alone now. Behind him, the final shuttle vanished into the distortion, carrying the last survivors of 3 civilizations: the Valen, the Syrinx, and the humans. More than 100,000 souls. Safe for now. He should have gone with them. The mission was to escape, not to stay. But the stabilizer core had failed. Without manual control, the wormhole would implode, devouring both ends, erasing not just the gate, but the colony world beyond. And so, Elias stayed. The Valen engineers had begged him to flee. The Syrinx commander had screamed in disbelief. "Why would you die for this?" she'd said. "There is no honor in extinction." Elias hadn't answered. He just looked at her, a calm, tired smile on his lips. Now with the shuttles gone and the gate tearing itself apart, that smile was gone. Only the hum remained. He placed his hand on the stabilizer console. The field was flickering, pulsing weakly like a fading heartbeat. He could almost feel it calling him, like a dying child asking to be held. Elias breathed in, slow and steady. "All right," he whispered. "Let's hold it together." He redirected his armor's power core into the gate's control system. The exosuit trembled, systems overloading, lights dimming one by one. Warnings flashed across his visor. Neural feedback risk. Critical. He ignored them. Energy poured from his body into the wormhole's stabilizer, a bright stream of electric blue light connecting him to the dying star bridge. The gate's violent shudder slowed, fraction by fraction. The light around him steadied. For the first time in hours, the hum softened, and Elias smiled again, weakly, painfully. "Still here," he muttered. Above him, the void shimmered with strange colors, violet ripples spreading across the black like oil on water. The wormhole's energy was shifting into unknown frequencies, rewriting the laws of space itself. To the watching aliens aboard the refugee ships now far beyond the gate, human technology appeared to merge with the cosmos. The feed from their sensors showed one man, one human, standing before the eye of creation, surrounded by fire, light, and darkness intertwined. He was holding it open with nothing but his will. The Valen High Scholar watched in awe, trembling. He's merging with the singularity field. No being could survive that. The Syrinx commander clenched her claws. Then why doesn't he stop? "Because," whispered the human pilot beside her, eyes wet, "he's buying us time." Elias could feel his mind fragmenting. The neural feedback from the stabilizer had crossed every threshold known to medical science. Pain seared through him, electric and absolute, but something deeper began to awaken within that agony. He could see things now, beyond the colors, beyond the light. He saw echoes, lives, memories, fragments of time suspended between stars. He saw children playing under alien skies. He saw oceans of glass, forests of light, faces of people he'd never met but had just saved. He saw meaning. And then, something else. A figure within the gate. Formless yet luminous. Not a god, not a ghost, but a presence beyond definition. It seemed to study him, its voice like wind over water. You could let go. Elias's reply was barely a whisper. Not yet. The figure's light pulsed softly as if amused. You are not built for eternity. Elias grinned through the blood trickling from his nose. No one is. But we try anyway. For a moment, everything froze. The stars, the light, even time itself. Then, the gate roared to life. An explosion of white fire surged outward, shaking every ship within light minutes. The stabilizer core reached full synchronization, but the overload had a cost. Elias's body was dissolving in the energy storm, piece by piece. He looked down at his hands, now translucent, dissolving into threads of light. Yet there was no fear in his eyes, only peace. His last thought was of Earth, of the smell of rain, the laughter of his little sister, the ocean waves against his skin. Worth it, he whispered. Then the feed cut out. The explosion consumed the gate, folding in on itself, leaving behind only silence. The wormhole stabilized just long enough for the refugees to clear the collapse zone. And then, it was gone. Only a field of drifting starlight remained where a man had once stood. Days later, the refugees' fleet hovered in the calm darkness of uncharted space. The aliens gathered in the central hall, Valen, Syrinx, and Human, silent before a single hologram, a recording of Elias's final moment. The Valen High Scholar spoke first, her voice trembling. He died to save us all. Even though most of us were not his kind, the Syrinx commander bowed her head. Among my people, death is for the clan, for the bloodline. He died for strangers. I cannot understand it, the human pilot whispered. That's what makes us us. And for the first time in galactic history, 3 species, divided by language, war, and biology, stood in a moment of shared silence. Above them, the new star born from Orion Gate's collapse shimmered, a small pulsing blue light. They named it Thorn's Star. They didn't know that somewhere beyond their sensors. A faint echo still lingered, a fragment of consciousness drifting between the quantum filaments of reality. A voice, soft, human, still here, veered there alone, anchored to the last operational stabilizer tower, staring into the storm. Behind him, the last convoy of refugee vessels crawled toward the gate's threshold. Thousands of alien civilians, none human, fled their dying worlds. They didn't understand the man who had stayed behind to hold the storm open. They couldn't. To them, self-sacrifice was a myth whispered in fear, a thing done only by gods or fools. But humans had a long memory of fire. Inside the command hub of the collapsing structure, the air had gone thin and metallic. Emergency systems moaned with a dying frequency. Artificial gravity flickered, alternating between sudden crushing weight and dizzying freefall. Only one voice remained on the open comm line, a soft, deliberate breathing pattern, the kind soldiers learned when every inhale might be their last. "Raman," said Lieutenant Maya from the evacuation cruiser, her voice breaking through static. "You're past the window. You need to come through. Now." The captain didn't reply, not with words. He looked at the holographic display attached to his wrist. The stabilizers were bleeding power at an exponential curve. One more surge and the entire ring would collapse, taking the wormhole with it. If the wormhole died, the refugees, 12 ships of terrified, desperate lives, would be trapped in a war zone with nowhere to go. The enemy fleets were already burning through the Orion sector like a tide of black flame. They'd be slaughtered in hours. He placed his hand on the last stabilizer core. It thrummed beneath his palm like a living heart. Far beyond the ring, inside, the lead refugee vessel Kalen 7, alien eyes stared at the human on the external feed. The Kelthir had no word for what he was doing. Their species understood survival. They understood cunning, bargaining, fleeing, but staying behind, choosing death so that others who were not his kin, not his blood, not even his species, might live. It was madness. Elder Saroon, his translucent fins shimmering with fear, leaned closer to the screen. Why does he remain? The threshold will close. He could have escaped with us. One of the younger Kyle-Thyr, voice trembling, whispered, "Perhaps. He has nothing left to lose." "No," said Sarun slowly, tasting the human gesture of a salute still burned into his memory. "No. He has something we do not understand." The stabilizer screamed. Eli slammed his gauntlet into the manual override, locking the field into place. The shockwave nearly tore his arm from the socket. Warning symbols flared across his HUD, crimson and gold like a battlefield sunrise. His oxygen reserves were down to 15 minutes. But oxygen wasn't the real clock. The real clock was the singularity. It was unraveling. He could feel it, not through instruments but in the marrow of his bones. A strange low-frequency hum that crawled through his nerves, a sound older than language. Space itself was folding inward. He thought of Earth. Not the polished domes of New Geneva, but the smell of wet soil after rain in Karachi, his grandmother's garden, the call to prayer echoing through humid dusk. He remembered the way light fell on rooftops just before night. That, more than anything else, steadied him. In the dark of space, faith didn't come with rituals. It came in breaths. It came when a man stared into the abyss and whispered, not because someone might answer, but because silence was unbearable otherwise. Eli didn't pray to be saved. He prayed to finish. He looked at the wormhole and whispered beneath his breath, "Let them make it through." On the Kalen 7, Sarun's second-in-command hissed, "The singularity will crush him when it collapses." "Yes," the elder answered. "Then why?" "Because," Sarun said, his voice trembling like glass. "He believes something we do not, that strangers are worth dying for." And in that moment, something ancient shifted in the Kyle-Thyr elder's chest, not belief, but doubt. For the first time in his long life, he doubted his people's certainty that only blood mattered. A tremor passed through the structure, throwing Eli against a bulkhead. The force cracked something in his ribs. Pain lanced bright and cold, but he didn't scream. He couldn't. Every muscle was focused on holding the stabilizer in alignment. The entire Orion Gate was groaning under the weight of space trying to swallow itself. "Rahman," Maya's voice came again. This time it was no longer an order. It was a plea. "Don't do this." Eli closed his eyes. He saw her face, the way she used to laugh over ration coffee, the way she always tied her hair like she was ready for a fight. She had someone to live for. That was why she was on the other side of the gate. He didn't reply. The stabilizer's field expanded, forcing the wormhole back into coherence. Refugee ships flickered across its horizon like fireflies against a midnight sea. One after another, they vanished into the swirling blue. Eli felt his breath slowing. His body temperature dropped. His heartbeat was steady, not calm but resolute. It wasn't the first time a human had chosen to die so others might live. But this time, there was no army behind him, no medals, no speeches, only the stars. And the silence. On the final transport, Elder Sarun lifted a clawed hand toward the image of the human. "Mark this moment," he whispered to the younglings huddled around him. "Remember his face. Our archives speak of conquests and power. But this is something greater." The young alien stared at Eli's unmoving figure against the storm. "What do you call it?" Sarun hesitated, then softly, "Human." The last ship breached the threshold. Eli felt the stabilizer give way beneath him. The wormhole convulsed. Time stretched. Sound vanished. For a moment, the universe became weightless, a single heartbeat suspended between life and the void. Eli saw the starfield warp like liquid glass. He could feel space trying to crush him, like a hand closing around an ember. He didn't fight it. He held, because someone had to. And as the light from the wormhole flared brighter than a sun, he whispered the last thing that came to him. Not to be heard, not to be recorded. "Not luck," he breathed, voice fading into static. "Someone wanted me to live, long enough to let them through." On the other side of the gate, Maya collapsed to her knees as the feed cut to black. No explosion, no final scream. Just a sudden, infinite silence. A silence heavy enough to carve itself into memory. Elder Saroon lowered his head. "He is gone," he said softly. "But he has left something behind." "What?" Saroon turned toward the wormhole's fading light. A question that would haunt 1,000 alien civilizations. Why would a human give everything for those who were nothing to him? The wormhole sealed with the soundless sigh of the universe exhaling. No fire, no thunder. Just a slow, quiet folding of space like the last page of a story closing itself. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the convoy of refugee ships drifted into the cold. Still void of the Valar expanse, a starless gulf, silent and endless. Emergency thrusters hissed softly against the black. Navigation lights blinked like faint candles in a cathedral of night. On the bridge of the lead vessel, Kalen 7, Elder Saroon pressed a trembling claw against the observation window. Eyes fixed on the empty space where the gate had been. The martyr was gone. Not a body. Not a trace. Just light burned into memory. It began with a silence too heavy to name. The bridge crew did not speak. Not out of reverence, they didn't know the human well enough for that. But something in the way he had stood against the storm had carved a hollow inside their chests. A space where logic couldn't quite breathe. A young Kelthir officer finally broke the quiet. "Elder?" His voice faltered, soft and uncertain. "Why?" Saroon didn't answer at first. His gaze was distant, somewhere between stars and memory. He was old. Old enough to remember the wars of the first frontier when their people abandoned the weak to survive. Old enough to know their entire civilization was built on a single merciless law: only your own matters. And yet, a single human had undone it. "He gave us passage," Saroon finally said, his voice low and cracked, "and asked for nothing. But he's dead." "Yes." The young officer struggled with that word as if his language didn't have enough gravity to hold it. "And no one forced him?" Saroon turned his gaze on the boy. His fins trembled. "That is what we must understand." Across the convoy, alien refugees crowded around projection feeds that showed the last captured frames of Captain Eli Rahman. The image was blurred, distorted by radiation, but clear enough to make them feel something they couldn't quite name. A human, standing alone against the storm. The Kelthir language had no word for sacrifice. They had only a word for cost. The calculated exchange of loss for gain. But this was something different. It wasn't a bargain. It was a gift, and gifts in their culture were dangerous things. They carried debts that could not be measured. A mother pulled her hatchling close, whispering in a broken tone, "He didn't know us. He didn't even know our names." Another refugee shook his head. "Then why?" And no one could answer. Maya sat alone in the medbay of the human support ship Solace, knees drawn up, hands clenched around a ration cup she'd forgotten to drink. Her uniform was stained with soot and ash. Her eyes, once sharp with the focus of a soldier, were unfocused now, as if part of her still waited for a transmission that would never come. The system recorded no last message. No heroic speech, just static and light, the way Eli would have wanted it. "Captain Rahman is declared." The AI voice cut off when she slammed her fist into the console. She didn't want the word. Dead. It sounded too clean, too small for a man who held back a storm. She whispered to the empty room, "You stubborn bastard. You didn't even say goodbye." Her breath caught. And then came the thing she had feared most, the silence after the anger. The silence that let grief in. The refugee fleet settled into the Valar expanse, guided by preset coordinates encoded by human command before the gate battle. The humans hadn't just opened the path. They had planned every detail of their escape: food caches, atmosphere bubbles, medical drones, navigation beacons. Everything was arranged for a people who weren't even theirs. For the Kelthir, this was incomprehensible. Back on their homeworld, if a village fell, the cities didn't help. If a ship burned, no fleet turned back. There were no alliances outside bloodlines. To help strangers was to waste what little one had. Yet the humans had built entire strategies around saving others. Some whispered fearfully that this was a trap. Others argued it was pity. But deep inside, in the quiet corners of their hearts, a small spark of shame began to burn. A gathering formed on Kalen 7, elders, officers, surviving scholars. Sarun stood at the center, an old warrior who had never feared an enemy fleet, but feared the silence this human sacrifice had left behind. "He has unsettled us," a council member hissed. "Our people look at his image as if he were a god." "He was a soldier," another spat. "Nothing more. Flesh and bone." Sarun's gaze hardened. "And yet he did what none of us would have done." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Kelthir prided themselves on strength, on ruthless clarity, but that clarity cracked like thin ice before the memory of a man who died for strangers. "What are you suggesting, Sarun?" someone challenged. "That we become like him?" The elder lowered his head slowly, the gesture alien but heavy with weight. "I am saying we must decide what kind of people we want to be when someone like him stands against the storm." Silence. And in that silence, for the first time in generations, the Kelthir Council had no answer. Meanwhile, on the Solace, Maya stood at the observation deck, hands pressed to the glass. A black expanse stretched before her, so vast it felt like it might swallow everything human ever built. She remembered Eli not as the captain who held the gate, but as the man who argued with her about the best instant coffee brand, the man who hummed old songs under his breath during maintenance shifts, the man who, when she was bleeding on the sands of Ophiuchus 9, whispered, "I won't leave you." She felt the ache sharpen. But beneath it there was something else, a current, deep and steady. Pride. He hadn't died for nothing. He had held the line, and the universe would remember, even if it hated the reminder. Whispers spread through the convoy, first like drifting ash, then like wind-catching flame. The human, the martyr, the one who held the sky. What began as a single image in a comm feed became a story, mutating, growing, passing from one ship to another. The refugees added fragments, details, embellishments. They spoke of how his armor glowed like a star, how his voice shook the storm. Some claimed he stood on the gate's surface without fear. Others said he smiled before the end. The truth no longer mattered. Eli Rahman had become a legend, and legends are dangerous things. The Kelthir Council met again, this time in secret. Fear lined their voices. "If they start believing in him, they will forget us," one elder hissed. "A human myth will shape our people," another countered. "Then maybe they should. Our ways led us to ruin. His gave us survival." Arguments grew hot and sharp, words slicing like knives. They were not just debating a man, they were debating the future. Outside the chamber, children traced Eli's symbol, his unit patch, into the frost on the viewports. Mothers told his story to hush their hatchlings at night. For the first time, their people were uniting around something that wasn't fear, around a stranger, around a human, and somewhere in that quiet, Sarun whispered to himself, "They will call him a savior, but he was not a god. He was just human." Maya lifted the captain's insignia from the black case in front of her. Regulation dictated it be sent to Earth, but something in her gut resisted. The Kelthir were already carving his story into their bones, maybe. Maybe they needed it more than Earth did. She turned toward the empty expanse, whispering to the stars. "They'll never understand why you did it. But they'll feel it." She didn't realize she was crying. The convoy burned silently toward the nearest star cluster, carrying with it not just a rescued people, but a seed. A small, dangerous seed that would grow into something much larger than a single man. For the Kelthir, history had always been about survival. Now, it might become about meaning, and humanity, without lifting another finger, had already changed them. At first it was just a story whispered on drifting ships, a broken chain of memories, half-truths and static, a human soldier standing alone at the edge of a collapsing wormhole holding the universe open with his hands. But legends do not stay small. By the time the Kelthir convoy reached the neutral rings of the outer axis, the tale of the martyr of Orion Gate had already slipped from the mouths of frightened refugees into the ears of traders, mercenaries, and data couriers. Within days it spread through black market networks like light through shattered glass, and with every retelling, the man became larger. In a cantina on the mining world of Drain 4, a reptilian trader raised his cup, voice slurred by fermented pulse grain. They say the human stood at the mouth of a star and did not blink. Across the table, a Sarai mercenary snorted. "A lie, no one does that." The traitor leaned closer. He didn't just stand there, he held it. The gate collapsed, but the ships escaped. 12 of them, full of Kael'thir refugees. The mercenaries' mandibles clicked uneasily. No one gives their life for strangers. Not even Sarai, not even gods. That's what makes it terrifying, the traitor said, lowering his voice. He did. The table fell quiet. On the diplomatic stations of the Argon Collective, the story took another shape. Here it was not told with awe, but with fear. Admiral Shore watched the projected footage stolen from Kael'thir archives. A single human, no fleet behind him, no demands for tribute, holding a collapsing wormhole long enough to save thousands of alien lives. The alien council chamber murmured like a disturbed, "Hive, this is unacceptable," hissed one of the counselors. "They are not supposed to do this. They're humans," Shore replied slowly, folding his hands behind his back. "Their entire history is unpredictable." "It is not unpredictability," another counselor spat. "It is contagion. This myth will spread. The Kael'thir were isolationists. Now their hatchlings chant the human's name in their sleep." He tilted his head, the metallic ridges on his skull catching the light. If a single human can shift the culture of an entire species, what happens if they do it again? The Kael'thir homeworld had been burning when the gate fell. Entire cities crushed under the invaders. Their culture was scarred, brittle, desperate to cling to something. And humans, without intending to, had handed them a symbol strong enough to rewrite the way they saw themselves. In Kael'thir settlement, domes across the outer axis, murals began appearing on steel walls. Not commissioned, not ordered, grown. The figure was always the same. A lone man in a black and gold pressure suit, standing before a storm of collapsing light, one hand raised like he was holding the sky apart. They painted him not as a god, but as something harder to ignore, a human. In a low-ceilinged corridor of Dome 4, a hatchling asked its mother, "Why did the human stay behind?" The mother hesitated because there was no Kael'thir word for why in that context, only cost. "Because," she said finally, voice soft, "he thought our lives mattered." The hatchling tilted its head, confused. "But we are not his blood." "No," she whispered. "And that is what makes it different." She didn't realize other parents were starting to repeat the same story. Meanwhile, on Solace, Maya stood before the captain's locker. She hadn't opened it since the day he died. Regulation said it should be sent to Earth, but she couldn't. Not yet. She pressed her palm against the steel door, the cold bleeding into her bones. "Commander," the ship's AI whispered gently, "the Kael'thir convoy has begun requesting human records. Poems, history archives, songs. They're calling it the Martyr's Earth." Maya froze. "What?" "They are asking for more of your kind." She exhaled slowly, almost laughing through her grief. "Of course they are. Even in death, Eli Rahman was doing what humanity had always done best, leaving fingerprints on the souls of others." In the Kael'thir Convoy Council, panic cracked through the leadership. Sarun stood against it like an old tree in a storm. "They sing his name," a military officer growled. "Children who once recited the creeds of bloodlines now chant Eli. We're losing control." "No," Sarun said softly. "We're gaining something we never had." The officer slammed a claw against the table. "We are Kael'thir, not human, not savages who throw their lives away for strangers. And yet," Sarun whispered, eyes narrowing, "a savage saved our kind." Silence. Sarun leaned forward. "For generations we told ourselves that strength is found in blood. But a stranger showed us strength we've never known. The people feel it. They're hungry for something more." Far across the stars, on a human colony world orbiting Beta Crucis, the news reached Earth Command. A young lieutenant burst into the briefing room, eyes wide. "Sir, the Kael'thir, they're building a shrine." Admiral Harper raised a brow. "To who?" The lieutenant hesitated. "To Captain Eli Rahman." For a moment no one spoke. Then the admiral leaned back, exhaling. "God help us. Not because it was wrong, but because it was powerful." The galaxy had seen humans as dangerous, stubborn, chaotic, but not holy. And holy things change everything. Weeks passed. The murals became sculptures. The sculptures became rituals. Refugee children touched their foreheads to carved steel plaques, whispering words they didn't understand but felt in their bones. "He stayed so we could live." Merchants began selling martyr charms, tiny metal figurines of a human holding the storm. Pilots painted his emblem on their ships. Soldiers who once fought for Kael'thir bloodlines began carrying patches with his name on their armor. This was no longer just remembrance. This was identity. And identities are the seeds of revolutions. In the core of Kael'thir High Command, the old guard watched with growing dread. "He is not one of us," one of the generals hissed, "and yet he leads our people from the grave." Sarun's eyes glimmered in the half-dark. That's what humans do. They lead not because they demand it, but because others choose it. Then this must be stopped. Sarun shook his head slowly. It's already too late. Among the refugees, a quiet movement began. Not formal. Not planned. It spread in shared glances, whispered prayers, unspoken vows. They called themselves the Children of the Gate. Not a religion. Not yet, but something close. They didn't worship Eli Rahman. They wanted to be like him, to stand when no one else did, to hold when everything else broke. Maya received the first message 3 months after the gate. "We have named a star after him," Sarun's voice said through the translator. "Not as a god, but as the place where we learned what it means to be more." She stood alone on the observation deck, eyes burning. Eli had not lived to see it, but the galaxy was beginning to bend around the echo of his choice. Legends are dangerous. Empires fear them. Armies march behind them. And sometimes the smallest act, a single human choosing to die for strangers, becomes a fire no fleet can extinguish. The martyr of Orion Gate had no statue on Earth. But across the outer axis, his face was etched into walls, carved into songs, whispered into the dark like a promise. He was no longer a man, he was a story, and stories are immortal. The first fracture came quietly, not with an explosion, not with a scream, but with a single hatchling refusing to bow. On the Kael'thir refugee world of Vareth, beneath a stormlit sky, thousands gathered around the obsidian square, a circular plaza where elders recited bloodline creeds every rotation. For centuries, the Kael'thir had lived by those creeds. Strength belongs to blood. Loyalty belongs to kin. Strangers are storms. But that day, when the elder raised the ceremonial staff and called for the young to kneel, one child remained standing, a small, fragile Kael'thir with silver fins and trembling hands. But their eyes, those were steady. When the elder barked for obedience, the child lifted their chin and said 4 words that had already burned across 1,000 star systems. He died for strangers. The crowd stilled. Even the storm quieted for a heartbeat, and something inside the Kael'thir people cracked. On the Solace, orbiting far from Vareth, Commander Maya watched the footage replayed through a secure feed. The child's voice was thin, shaking, but the effect was a lightning bolt across a dry forest. "Repeat that," she whispered, to the AI. "He died for strangers," it hit her chest like a hammer. The Kael'thir had no concept for sacrifice, not in their history, not in their language. But now children were standing in public squares, defying blood to honor a human they'd never met. The martyr of Orion Gate wasn't just a story anymore. He was a revolution in motion. Elder Sarun stood at the center of the High Council chamber on Vareth. His bones ached, not from age, but from the weight of what he was watching unfold. "They've begun refusing the blood oaths," spat General Lakar, his scaled fingers tightening on the table's edge. "Children, soldiers, even healers." "It's just whispers," another officer muttered, though his voice betrayed unease. Sarun shook his head slowly. "Whispers are how storms begin." He gestured toward the wall projection, flickering footage of Kael'thir youth painting murals of Eli Rahman on their barracks walls. Human symbols woven into Kael'thir songs. The children of the gate growing into something more organized. "They're not rejecting us," Sarun said softly. "They're rejecting what we used to be." "Which is worse," growled Lakar, "because now they want to be human." The words were spat like venom, but they tasted like fear. Far across the outer axis, alien governments were watching too. In the cold halls of the Argon Collective, Admiral Shore addressed a shadow council. His voice was sharp, precise. "They are not just building monuments," he said. "They are building ideology." "Then crush it," hissed one counselor. "Silence the Kael'thir." Shore's eyes narrowed. "You cannot silence a ghost, especially one born of choice." Another counselor slammed their fist against the table. He was just a human soldier. And yet, Shore replied, almost whispering, he is rewriting species. The chamber fell silent. For 1,000 cycles, the Argon had believed themselves the architects of the galaxy's order. But now a single human sacrifice had slipped through the cracks of power like a seed into fertile soil, and it was growing. The Kylthir cities on Vareth began to divide. The older generation clung to the bloodline creeds with desperate claws, whispering that to follow a human myth was to abandon their identity. They painted over murals, outlawed human songs, and punished those who spoke Eli's name aloud. But the young wore his emblem on their sleeves. The young sang in the night. The young believed that bloodlines were chains, and that a stranger's courage had broken them. One evening, Sarun walked through the streets of Lower Vareth. The old city smelled of wet iron and salt. In an alley lit by blue street lamps, he saw a group of hatchlings gathered around a stolen datapad, watching archived footage from the gate. Their faces glowed in the light as Eli Rahman stood alone before the collapsing wormhole. Their fins fluttered with something the Kylthir had no word for: hope. The elder watched them in silence, the ache in his chest spreading, not pain, but something worse, a fragile, dangerous tenderness. He had spent a lifetime preaching that strength was for the blood, but these children saw strength in a stranger, and perhaps they were right. The first act of rebellion wasn't a riot. It was a song. In the great blood hall of Vareth, where for generations only the names of ancestors were spoken, a group of young Kylthir stepped forward during a bloodline ceremony. Before the elders could speak, they began singing. The melody was human. Old Earth war songs, translated into the broken, halting syllables of the Kylthir tongue. It wasn't beautiful. It was raw, but it was enough. The guards hesitated to intervene. The old priest screamed for order, but the sound grew louder. The crowd joined in, and something sacred to the old ways fractured. Maya watched from orbit as the reports came in. Unauthorized gatherings, cultural contamination, symbolic rebellion. The Kylthir government was calling for containment. Some factions wanted human contact severed completely. And yet, the people kept whispering Eli's name like a prayer. She touched the captain's insignia she still carried, the metal warm against her skin. "You're not even here," she whispered, voice rough. "And you're leading them." She didn't know whether to cry or smile. Admiral Harper of Earth Command stood before a hollow map showing the outer axis burning, not with war, but with ideas. "This is getting out of control," a strategist warned. "Alien governments are accusing us of cultural subversion." Harper rubbed his temples. "We didn't do anything." A bitter laugh from the room. "Exactly. That's the problem. One dead soldier is causing more disruption than a fleet ever could." Another general leaned forward. "This could be an opportunity." Harper's gaze snapped up. "Admiral, the galaxy has always feared our fleets, our weapons, but now they fear our humanity." The room fell silent at the weight of those words. Back on Vareth, the old guard struck first. Militia forces raided a gathering of the Children of the Gate, seizing their banners and symbols. The elders broadcast a declaration: "No stranger defines the Kylthir." But the crowd outside the broadcast hall erupted before the message finished. The square filled with thousands of Kylthir, young and old, chanting not in defiance but in unity. "He stayed so we could live." What began as whispers turned into roars. The rebellion was no longer an idea. It had become a movement. Sarun stood at the balcony of the council hall as the chants echoed through the night. Torches flickered, banners waved. In all his long years, he had never seen his people united like this, not by fear, not by blood, but by something far stranger. Something more dangerous, a human choice. "Eli Rahman," Sarun whispered to the night sky, "you've broken us so that we might become something new." Far away, Maya received Sarun's encrypted message. "Your captain's name has become a sword and a lantern." "We cannot control what comes next. No one can." She sat alone, the stars burning cold beyond the glass. She could almost hear Eli's voice, steady and calm. "Then let them choose, Maya. That's what makes us human. Revolutions are not born in palaces. They are born in whispers, in children refusing to kneel, in stories that outlive their tellers." And somewhere in the storm that was coming, the galaxy was beginning to understand. Humans don't conquer by force alone. They conquer by being remembered. The last wave of the alien convoy disappeared through the fractured wormhole with the silent grace of desperation. The wormhole was no longer a tunnel. It was a storm, a shrieking hurricane of bent spacetime and devouring gravity. Every pulse of its instability burned through the emergency stabilizers like acid through silk. Commander Elias Ward's exosuit groaned against the pull, plates straining, servos screaming beneath the load of keeping the event horizon open. Inside his visor, a dozen warnings flashed crimson. Reactor overload, structural collapse, cellular degradation from the exotic energy field. He could feel the wormhole gnawing at his bones. He tightened his grip on the stabilizer rods embedded into the fractured surface of the Orion Gate. The gate was not a structure anymore. It was a wounded god, bleeding reality into the void. Space screamed, time bled, and Elias refused to let it fall. Behind him, a handful of alien engineers from the Vorka clung to the observation deck, their luminescent skin reflecting the white-hot glare of space-time rupture. One of them, Veshra, stared at Elias not with fear but with something stranger, something the Vorka had no word for. Awe. The humans had fought, yes. But what Elias was doing was beyond war. He wasn't defending territory. He wasn't preserving bloodlines. He was giving up everything for those who were not even his own. Elias gritted his teeth as another surge slammed into him. Blood streamed from his nose. His fingers felt like they were splintering into photons. He could hear the wormhole whispering now. Not in words, but in pure, devouring intent. Collapse. 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 He thought of the refugees on the other side. Thousands of alien civilians. Entire fleets carrying families, history, fragile dreams. If the gate closed too early, the gravitational shear would shred their ships like dust in a turbine. He whispered, barely audible through the comm static. Not yet. The stabilizers flared brighter, forcing the wormhole wider against the entropy tearing at its edges. In the command center orbiting high above, Crethary commanders watched the humans' biometrics spike into terminal levels. One of them muttered, "He is dying," another responded with genuine confusion. Why? The evacuees are not his kind. A third, older, scarred from 100 wars, stared into the storm. That is what makes it terrifying. Elias could no longer feel his legs. The exosuit was the only thing keeping him upright. He remembered a field back on Earth. Sunlight over his mother's house, the warmth of soil under bare feet. He had volunteered knowing there might be no return. Not because of medals, not for a name etched in stone, because someone had to hold the door. Far below the gate, alien refugee ships flickered like fireflies vanishing into safety. Their pilots looked back once, not to say goodbye, but because they could not comprehend why a human remained behind. Veshra's translator sputtered through static. "Why, Ed, do you endure?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. His body was the answer. The stabilizer alarms hit maximum. 12 seconds to total collapse. The wormhole's surface writhed like a living thing, screaming in colors that had no name. The universe was tearing. And yet, the humans still stood. In that moment, something shifted inside the alien watchers. Not logic, not strategy. Something older, something sacred. The Vorka would later call it the moment of silence. The Crethari would name it the turning of stars. But among humans, it was just called duty. As the wormhole devoured the last convoy, Elias whispered a final prayer not to survive but to hold. His voice was calm, almost serene. Just a little longer. The stabilizers erupted in a cascade of light. And then, everything went white. When the wormhole finally collapsed, it did not roar. It breathed out, a vast, soundless sigh that swept across the void like the fading heartbeat of something ancient. The fabric of space folded in on itself, sealing the wound. Where once had been a blazing gate between galaxies, there remained only a scar, a thin ripple of dark light, drifting like smoke in the cold. In that silence, the fleet on the far side floated in stunned stillness. The refugees, the Vorka, the Crethari, the scattered remnants of other conquered species had made it through. But none of them celebrated. The light that held the gate had been human, and that light was gone. Commander Elias Ward had not screamed. He had not begged. He had stood against a dying star's worth of power and refused to move. And now, the galaxy felt the weight of his absence like a sudden winter. Aboard the alien flagship Tashara, Veshra pressed his luminous hands against the viewport, watching the last shimmer of the Orion Gate fade into black. His species did not weep, but his chest burned with something he could not name. They had survived because a human had chosen to stand alone. Why would someone give their life for strangers? The question echoed in Veshra's mind like a pulse. Vorka culture did not honor sacrifice, it calculated benefit. Krithari warriors died for conquest, not strangers. But Elias, he had held the universe open and stepped into its mouth willingly. The fleet's comnet, usually filled with frantic traffic, was eerily silent. Even the younglings didn't make a sound. The survivors were waiting, though they didn't know for what. Then, slowly, the Krithari war leader, known as Vral Kesh, rose from his seat of iron. His species revered strength above all else. Yet his voice was low, trembling like a man who had glimpsed something larger than war. He stood, Vral Kesh murmured. Against the end, the officers around him lowered their heads, not as subjects to a ruler but as soldiers before something sacred. Across the refugee fleet a ripple spread, not of words, but of silence. Entire species who had never agreed on anything shared a single, wordless moment of reverence. There were no hymns in space, but in that silence, something very close to prayer began to breathe. On the human side of the galaxy, the loss of Elias Ward spread like wildfire through encrypted channels and military black nets. Soldiers in distant outposts stopped eating. Colonists stood outside their habitats and stared at the night sky. The name Elias Ward became a whisper passed from one world to the next, not as a war hero, but as the man who held the gate. In the Krithari council chamber, Veshra and Vral Kesh stood before the projected image of Earth, an old star's light reflected in blue. He did not fight to win, Veshra said softly. He fought so we could live. Vral Kesh tilted his head, his rough skin catching the faint light. No Krithari would do that. No Vorka, no anyone. No, Veshra whispered. Only human. The two species stared at the blue world. They had studied humans for their unpredictability, their brutality, their stubborn refusal to die. But this was something different. A human had given everything, not for profit, not for empire, not even for his own kind, for them. Among the refugee flotilla, small things began to change. Vorka children traced human insignias on bulkhead walls. Krithari soldiers laid their weapons on the floor for 1 minute of stillness before duty. No decree commanded this. No priest ordained it. It was born from a silence too vast to ignore. And deep within their new staging system in the orbit of a cold sun, a decision began to take shape. The aliens would build a monument not of marble or metal but of starlight itself. A single beacon in the void, forever facing the place where Elias Ward had stood. They called it the Orion Vigil. Yet far from them, in a place between light and void, something stirred. Elias Ward's last breath had been torn from his body at the exact moment the wormhole imploded. For most beings, that was the end. But humans had a way of defying endings. In the aftermath of collapse, fragments of quantum stabilizer arrays and his exosuit floated in a gray, weightless nowhere, a pocket between universes. Elias lay motionless in the storm's ghost, his body suspended like an ember in ash. He could not move, could not speak, but he existed, and in that impossible stillness something else watched him. Not alien, not human, something older. The silence was no longer empty. It listened. Elias's last thought had not been fear, it had been a whisper. Just a little longer. And the void answered. Silence became a shape. Not the kind of silence that follows death, but the silence that precedes creation. The hush between breaths when the universe decides whether to continue. Commander Elias Ward floated inside it, suspended in a place that was not space, not time. His body was burned, shredded by gravitational shear. Yet something held him together. Around him stretched a boundless horizon of shifting light, like the inside of a collapsed star, where physics whispered rather than shouted. Fractals shimmered like cathedral windows built from starlight. Streams of quantum data wove themselves into constellations. Every heartbeat echoed like a hammer striking creation. But Elias wasn't breathing. The last beat of his heart had ended minutes, hours, Centuries ago. Time didn't mean anything here. He should have been ash scattered across nothing. Yet a faint glow radiated from his chest, where his reactor core and his human heart had once shared the same rhythm. Then came the presence. It had no face. No shape. It was not an alien, not a god, not anything that could be named. It moved like gravity, spoke like wind through a dying sun. Human. The word did not travel through air. It unfolded inside him, bypassing language, threading directly into the quiet part of his soul that still believed in something beyond flesh. Elias tried to speak, but his throat didn't work. So the thought answered instead. Am I dead? The presence pulsed like a star collapsing inward. Not yet. He tried to remember Earth, his mother's house. The gate, the storm, the faces of thousands of alien refugees, their ships streaking through light as he held the impossible open. They lived. The thought was warm. Not triumphant, not proud, grateful. They lived because you chose the fire. He wanted to ask what this was, what it wanted. But the presence didn't feel like it wanted anything. It simply was. It pressed deeper, not invading, but listening, searching for the thing that made a fragile creature of carbon choose to burn itself alive for strangers. And then, softly, like a prayer remembered in darkness, Elias thought, someone had to hold the door. The presence stilled. Something vast shifted in that silence. Not awe, not confusion. Something closer to curiosity. Your kind dies. For those not your own? Yeah, Elias thought. That's what we do. Others kill for dominion. Your species dies for faith. Not faith, he answered, as his heartbeat flickered like the ember of a dying star. Choice. The presence did not understand, but it listened. It pressed closer, and something impossible happened. The collapsing light around him stopped shrinking. Instead, it bloomed outward like a star-going supernova, except this light didn't destroy. It remembered. It mirrored him. Where his blood should have been, light flowed. Where his bones had shattered, they were rewritten in shimmering lattices, not healed, transformed. We cannot create what you are, the voice said, not with envy, but with something approaching reverence. But we can carry you forward. And then the void opened its hand. A lattice of energy enfolded Elias's form, weaving the fractured pieces of his exosuit into something new, lighter, sharper, alive. It fused technology, memory, and something far older than human engineering. His eyes opened, not with breath, but with purpose. The starless silence around him shivered as the presence spoke one last time. You held the door, now. Hold the stars. Light consumed him. On the other side of the galaxy, months had passed. The Orion Vigil hung above the new refugee world, a colossal monument built from fragments of the gate. Thousands gathered beneath its glow every cycle. Vorka, Krithari, and others united by something none of them had a name for. They lit no candles. They spoke no prayers. They simply stood in silence facing the void. That silence was their shared language now. Among them, Veshra stood before the beacon. He had replayed the collapse over and over in his mind. He had tried to understand the human. He never could. But something in him had changed. A species raised on logic was learning reverence. Then the vigil flared. Not the programmed glow. Not power surge, a pulse. A heartbeat. Refugees gasped. Krithari warriors dropped to their knees. Instruments screamed with impossible readings. Gravitational echoes radiating from the collapsed gate coordinates. Something was coming through that should not exist. Far above the planet, Krithari sensor arrays caught a flash in deep orbit. A shape emerged from the scar of the Orion Gate, drenched in light, trailing fragments of broken time behind it. It wasn't a ship. It was a man. Elias Ward drifted into real space. Not his flesh, not his ghost. His body glimmered like a star wearing armor, every breath a ripple through gravity. His heart pulsed in rhythm with something far greater than himself. The galaxy had called him dead. The void had called him forward. And now the man who held the gate had returned. The stars trembled when Elias Ward returned. He emerged from the scar in space like a storm wearing the shape of a man. His body was no longer bound by the fragile limits of flesh alone. It was laced with something older, something woven from the silence between galaxies. His heartbeat echoed through the void like a slow, thunderous drum. Each pulse bent starlight, Each breath rippled through the dark. The refugee fleets that had fled through the Orion Gate drifted silently in orbit around their new homeworld. Millions stared upward as the Orion Vigil, the monument they'd built in reverence to a dead human, flared to life. Golden light poured from it like liquid dawn. Alarms screamed across Crithari ships. Vorka priests froze mid-chant, and then their sensors confirmed the unthinkable. The light was moving. The light had a heartbeat. The light was him. Elias's awareness came back in fragments. The last thing he remembered was holding the collapsing gate. Then the void had whispered. And now he stood among the stars again. Not as the broken soldier who had died, but as something else, not a god, not an angel. Just a human bound to the very forces he had refused to yield to. He opened his eyes. The stars were clearer than ever. Every frequency, every hidden pulse of the cosmos visible to him like veins of living light. Gravity was no longer a weight. It was a language, and it spoke to him. Hold the stars, the presence had said, and he understood now. He could shape the fracture left by the gate. Far below, millions of alien refugees watched as his luminous figure descended slowly toward their atmosphere. Veshra stood at the front of the assembly, every fiber of his being trembling. He had studied humans, admired their stubbornness, but this was beyond stubbornness. This was becoming the impossible. Crithari war leader Vralkesh knelt first. His people did not kneel, but his knees bent to the weight of what he saw. Not out of fear, but out of something that shook even their warrior hearts. Awe. He came back. Someone whispered. No. Another voice answered. He didn't leave. When Elias touched the ground, the earth itself shivered beneath his boots. Energy bled softly from his form like sunlight spilling through cracks. Veshra stepped forward slowly, unsure whether he was looking at a man or a star wearing human skin. Elias Ward, Veshra whispered, voice breaking. You died. Elias looked at him, and his smile was the same tired, warm, stubborn smile of the soldier who had once held the door. I didn't die, he said softly. I stayed. The aliens did not understand how he lived. They didn't have to. It wasn't something to understand. It was something to witness. Elias walked to the base of the Orion Vigil. The monument they had built for him, a towering spear of fractured gate material, pulsed as he approached. The moment his hand touched it, the vigil exploded in light, sending a pulse across the star system like a flare thrown into eternity. Ships across orbit received the pulse. It carried no weapon code, no command, no data, only a simple human signature, Elias Ward, Orion Gate. The Vorka fell silent. The Crithari warriors, a people born for conquest, lowered their weapons, not out of defeat but reverence. And in that silence something shifted in the galaxy. In the shadows of the Orion scar, distant predators stirred. The Sarth Dominion, who had been hunting these refugees, detected the pulse and recognized it for what it was. Defiance. Human defiance. They had expected prey. What they now saw was a rallying star. The Dominion fleet turned its eyes toward the refugee system. War was coming again, but this time they would not be facing desperate aliens alone. This time, they would face the man who would not die. As enemy ships crossed the edge of the system, panic began to ripple through the refugee fleet. Old wounds reopened. They had lost everything once. Could they survive another storm? Elias Ward stood beneath the vigil, looking toward the black horizon where the enemy approached. His voice carried across every comm channel, every mind tuned to the frequency of survival. You ran once, and you survived because I held the line, he said. His voice was calm, solid. But today you don't run. Today we hold the stars. Vralkesh raised his war axe to the sky. For the gatekeeper, he roared. Veshra, trembling but resolute, added his voice. For the light that stood alone. And then, for the first time in their fractured histories, the refugees, Vorka, Crithari, and others, answered together. For humanity. The Dominion fleet dropped out of warp like a storm. Hundreds of black ships darkened the stars. Elias raised his hand. The scar of the gate behind him responded. The void remembered him, and where once had been nothing, light gathered, curving, spiraling, becoming something new. The Orion Gate opened again, but this time, it wasn't a fragile bridge. It was a weapon, a fortress, a star born of sacrifice. Elias stepped into the sky, wrapped in the light the void had given him. His body cut through vacuum like fire through winter. The enemy fleet loomed ahead, but he was no longer alone. 1,000 refugee ships ignited behind him, 1,000 hearts burned with the light of one human's choice. The battle that followed would be written in the histories of a dozen species, not as a war of conquest, but as a war of remembrance. The Dominion struck first. Elias answered with starlight, their weapons carved through darkness. His will bent the battlefield itself. Refugee ships, once fragmented and afraid, fought as a single storm under his lead. Forca engineers turned old transports into living cannons. Krithari warships charged like wolves under a burning moon. And through it all, Elias Ward burned like a lighthouse in a black sea. When the Dominion flagship fell, it wasn't because of overwhelming power. It was because they realized, too late, that they were fighting something they could not calculate. Something they could not break. A human willing to die once, and willing to stand again. The enemy scattered. The stars fell quiet once more. In the aftermath, the refugees stood beneath the glowing vigil, their world safe, their fear dissolved into reverence. Elias walked through their ranks not as a god, not as a king, but as a man who had chosen to hold the door. And then the stars. Veshra approached him slowly. "You could have left us behind," he said softly. Elias looked up at the night sky, at the scar that had once killed him. His voice was almost a whisper. That's not what humans do. In the centuries that followed, the Orion Accord would become a new beacon of unity. The Orion Vigil remained standing, not to glorify one man, but to remind a galaxy of one truth. Humanity's strength was not in empire, not in conquest, but in its capacity to stand alone, so others wouldn't have to. They would call him the gatekeeper of Orion. But in his own heart, he was still just Elias Ward, a soldier who once whispered in the dark, just a little longer. And the stars had listened.